So let's just start right in. Tell us about your beginning, when you were born and what year and whatever you want to say about that.
I was born April Fool's Day, 1949,
Oh.
the youngest of three girls. I think my mother was expecting a boy. That was the April Fool's. I grew up in a small town in Queens, which is part of New York City. I became political at a very young age. I think my first action was when I was 10 years old, and I collected petitions against capital punishment when they were trying to, there was going to be an execution of a man named Carol Chessman.
Oh, yeah.
And I just seemed to get more political after that.
Did that come from your family or the school or just the times that you were living in? That would have been 1959. So it was...
My family was liberal democratic, but not particularly political.
Right.
My father died when I was 13 of multiple sclerosis.
Wow.
And I think I became open to several other people, started having influence on me from outside the family.
Interesting.
A political next door neighbor, a counselor I had in camp, and then the times were political. I mean,
Yes.
this was the early 60s. I was 13 in 1963, right? So it was a wonderful time to grow up. There was so much going on in the world, and I think I was just open to it.
So in high school, were you active also?
Yeah, my high school had just started to get integrated.
Okay.
It was Bayside High School, and they started busing black students in from Jamaica and Flushing, which are other parts of Queens. And there was a chapter of the Congress of Racial Equality was formed, and I became a member of the core chapter. So that was my involvement in high school. Also, I had an incident with my mother, she was very nervous about me because my father had died, and a friend of the family invited me to go to Washington with his family for the March on Washington. Oh. And she did not want me to go because she was afraid for me. And from then on, I started sneaking into the city to go to demonstrations. So I would go into the city and tell her I was going to the library, and there were a lot of demonstrations at that point in New York around community control of the schools. So I would go into the city, hang out with my friends, would go to a march across the Brooklyn Bridge, and I was always afraid that somebody would catch me on either a newspaper, photographer, or so I kept myself well hidden, but my mother never knew that I did that until much later.
Right. So high school, and then what happened next?
I went to college at NYU after applying to Cornell Labor Relations and getting rejected. Found out many years later they only took 6 women that year because they wanted women to go to home economics, the School of Home Economics, which is where both of my sisters went.
Interesting. They went to Cornell?
They went to Cornell.
In home economics.
When I didn't get into Cornell, I just told my mother I wanted to stay in the city. By that time, she'd remarried somebody who could afford it, and I applied very late to NYU and got into NYU.
Excellent. Well, it was a good choice, right?
It was a good choice, and there was a very active movement at NYU. So I got very active as soon as I got to NYU.
So what issues did you pursue in college? What was happening then?
Well, it started out with the Students Against the War, because Vietnam was the key issue.
Yep.
And then that morphed into a Students for a Democratic Society chapter, which I became part of. And the advantage to me of SDS, as opposed to just the anti-war movement, is there were more issues than just anti-war, right? There was civil rights, there was national liberation, there were workers' issues. There were workers at NYU who were on strike who we supported. And there were women's issues. And there was there was some struggle and discussion about whether we should be in a separate women's organization or stay part of SDS. There was a women's caucus in SDS. But I really believe, and I still believed, that all these issues are related to each other. You can't have, the war was related to the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was connected to the women's movement. and they were all connected to the labor movement. You can't separate them out, and that's why I found SDS so particularly more important than just the single.
Right. The SDS involvement with the women's issues, was that your first involvement, or did that come up in high school for you in any way?
Not as part of an organization. I was conscious of the issue, especially obviously after I got rejected
from Cornell.
And it always really bothered me that my sisters were relegated to this college, this home ec college. So I was certainly conscious of the issue.
Of individual
but I was a member of an organization.
Right. Anything else that you worked on, issues that you worked on in college that led you to other decisions?
Well, there was an organizing drive going on, and there was a strike, and we got involved in the strike. I remember, sitting on the curb, and I remember some woman from the neighborhood coming up and saying, "You shouldn't sit on the curb; it's going to give you hemorrhoids." And that was my first picket line, workers' picket line. But we were out there every day. But that was mainly through that. There were some students' rights issues. They tried to raise the tuition, believe it or not, to $2,400, and we protested it. So there were some student rights issues.
Right.
But it was mainly around SDS.
So what did you study in college?
I was an English major. My mother was an English teacher.
Okay.
And political science.
Okay.
But to tell you the truth, it was fascinating because so many of the teachers were also, this was 66 to 70, which is the height of the student movement, right? Kent State, 1970. I don't think I went to a class in 1970. And since most of my teachers were also, we sort of picked them based on them being political, they were very forgiving of if we were involved in the activities that were going on. They really didn't demand a lot of academics.
That's interesting too. Yes. So there was solidarity on the campus too. Right.
Yes.
So then you graduated, obviously.
Right.
And then what were your next moves in terms of picking work for yourself?
Mainly, I just worked a lot of different jobs. I worked. There was nothing that I studied that I didn't want to become a teacher. I basically wanted to. I spent a lot of time just on movement, political things, and at that point, making a living was pretty much just to make a living.
Right.
So I worked for the New York Public Library as a clerk. I worked in a bunch of print shops. I used to do layout for print shops, which was a skill I learned in the movement, how to make posters and how to cut and paste. I worked on a lot of student newspapers, things like that. I worked for UPS. I applied to UPS to be a driver, and they, of course, turned me into a customer service representative. And so I just worked a lot of different jobs. And then I worked in a factory because I believed, as part of my political understanding, that it was important for workers to be involved in progressive movements. So I went to work in a factory called Leviton, made switches. I packed switches.
Okay.
My daughter was born when I was working in the factory.
So when did you get married? Did you get married?
I was married. I married my husband. My husband and I met in college.
Okay.
And we got married in '73. I had my first child in '77. Okay. And the benefits for women, it was an IBW shop. The benefits for women were so terrible in that shop that I had Medicaid paid for my daughter's birth.
Oh, amazing.
I had to fight to get my job back because they had just passed the law in New York saying that they had to treat it like any other disability, and IBW did not particularly fight for me to get my job back. I had to go to the Human Rights Commission, and I got my job back and eventually got laid off.
Was that job, packing the switches, was that considered a man's job or
no? It was the women's
job.
It was an entire floor of women, and all the men were paid slightly better, but not. This is a minimum wage factory, basically. It was definitely a women's job.
So you got laid off from that job, and then what did you do next?
I eventually started working for UPS, and that's when my friend told me about the jobs at AT&T. But I was almost 30 by that point, so
Okay.
I had a lot of different experiences between then, and always was a member of some kind of political
Right. So you were doing politics,
organization.
earning a living, and
Having
and
care
having
of my
kids,
daughter.
and yeah, right, having a life, right? So, so what year did you go to work for AT&T?
Early 79.
Okay. Were you aware of the government's action with AT&T, the consent decree, when you looked for that job?
Yes, because I had friends who worked for both AT&T and for 9X,
Okay.
New York Tel at that point. They were also political women that I had known, and when jobs opened up, they called me and let me know that there was that because of the consent decree, I could get a job as a technician. I had no desire to become an operator.
Right.
And apologies to all my friends who were
Of course.
operators, but that just wasn't
Right. Or
wasn't
customer
for
service.
me.
So you deliberately chose to go to a non-traditional
Yes.
situation, right? So what was so you were a pioneer in as a result of the AT&T consent decree. You were one of the first hires in. Was that a technician a male category?
Yeah, and
Before
I
the
mean, I
consent
wasn't one of
decree?
there weren't a lot,
Mm-hmm.
but there were a few women in the office before me.
Okay.
I wasn't the first. There was probably 3 or 4 women. And at that point, I think they had really started ramping up the hiring. So,
Okay.
for example, they only hired, at the moment that I got hired, all of the people getting hired were women for the tech plant job, were either women or Vietnam vets. The Vietnam vets were the only men who were getting hired, because I think this was a few years after the consent decree. I think they were
Right.
really behind
Uh-huh.
on their hiring of women, and
Yeah.
they must have decided they had to ramp it up because
So they gave priorities
there were
to
about
people.
15 of us that got hired at the
Okay.
same time. We were all in a class
Okay.
together,
Okay.
and it was women and 2 men, 2 vets.
So what was the ratio in your job category at your place, roughly?
I mean, in the building that I worked in, there were probably 300 technicians. I would say there were probably 15, 20 women.
Okay, so women were still a decided minority.
Yes.
So what was that like to work in a job that had been reserved for men in the past?
Well, first of all, even though we were technicians, they really did discriminate in what kind of jobs they gave us as technicians. There were a lot of technicians' jobs that were more clerical in nature, though they were still considered technicians' jobs. They were going over trouble tickets. They weren't at the test board.
Okay.
I desperately wanted to be on the test board.
Right.
So, depending on how quickly we made it through this training, if you finished it quickly, they put you on the test board. So I was able to get onto the test board.
Okay.
I found out I got pregnant. My celebratory child. I got pregnant about a month and a half after I started working at AT&T with David, and I hid the fact that I was pregnant until I was 7 months pregnant.
Wow.
I just wore bigger and bigger shirts
Right.
because I was afraid that they would take me off the test board. So I wanted to go through all my training classes before I told them. And at that point, they had invested so much training in me that I knew they wouldn't take me off the test board. So that was issue number
Excellent.
1. Some of the men were fine. There were a lot of older guys who worked there. In fact, they were still, in the old days, the plant guys had to wear shirts and ties. They still wore shirts and ties, even though they had stopped 5 or 6 years before.
Okay.
A lot of those men, sort of refused to have anything to do with us.
All right.
And one of them actually said to me, when I asked them a question, he would never answer a question. When I did something particularly complicated on my own, he came up to me and said, "Now I know you can learn." Which I suppose was condescending, but I was so happy that he, and after that, he was, not only was he helpful, but became one of my biggest supporters when I became local,
That's interesting.
active in the local.
Huh. Interesting. So then, so what would you say, as someone who lived through that situation, what was the impact on the men and women of AT&T, the EEOC decision and the decree?
Well, I mean, it completely changed it completely changed the nature of the workplace. I mean, not only that, but I think because of the kind of women who put in for jobs like that, we were all very active and we were all very outspoken, and we're not shrinking violets, these women, and they really became sort of a major force in the workforce, not just as technicians, but in the union. I should back up a step, which is when I got there was a little organization called the Bell Busters, which was a group of sort of progressive people, and it had a lot of the women, the women who had started before me, were part of that. In fact, the woman who told me about the job was part of that. And we put out a little newspaper, and we basically criticized the all-male leadership of the local, and so I walked into a situation where I think the progressive women, really did have an impact. In fact, when I got back from my maternity leave, a woman had become the shop steward, and I immediately became her, which is a big deal. And
that's an elected position, correct?
Her assistant, second shop steward.
So did the men, just to be clear, the men had to elect the steward? The steward position was elected?
Yeah.
So the men by this time were willing not only to accept, but were willing to give the women leadership positions?
In my office they were, and
amazing.
It was really because, I'm telling you, the nature of the women who applied for those jobs, they were outspoken, and a lot.
So they had awareness. Yeah. They knew. Would you say they knew they were pioneers? That they were doing something special?
Yeah, I think they did.
I
think they did.
Making change.
Yeah.
Good. So then talk about. So then you stayed on the job.
The next big challenge, I think, for me was a divestiture happened.
Right.
And if it had gone exactly by seniority, we would have lost all the women in the office.
Right.
Because if they had moved us out by the least senior and said you all have to go to New York Telephone, then we would have been back to square one.
Right.
Fortunately, enough people wanted to go to transfer to New York Tel because a lot of people thought that was a more stable environment. It was a very big local that had the 9X people in it. A lot of people wanted to be part of that local. I specifically said did not go because of that, because I felt that in my local, based on my experience already, that there was a future for me in union leadership.
Okay.
I had worked on the Bell Buster. I had early on, I had started working for the local newspaper, and I had sort of gotten a name for myself a little bit from articles I had written.
Okay.
So if I had gone to the other local, I would have been lucky to become a shop steward.
Okay.
If I stayed in this local, it was much smaller. People knew each other. I knew I would have a chance to actually become union leadership. And that's why I stayed, even though my job was much less secure. So it was the right decision. I stayed. I became editor of the local newspaper.
Okay.
I won all kinds of newspaper awards.
So your English degree paid off in the end, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and my politics, to tell you the truth, because I wrote very rabble-rousing articles. And then I ran for secretary-treasurer, which is the typical women's position in many locals, but not in the locals, not in the
run locals, right? Yeah.
And then 2 years later, I ran against an incumbent president and 3 other men, and won on a first ballot.
So that's quite an achievement. So do you want to talk about why that happened?
I think it was sort of a perfect storm, to tell you the truth. My local was made up of people from New York and New Jersey.
Okay.
There were we had lost all of our operators very early on. That was one of my first actions actually in the local, is to organize a demonstration around the closing of our last operators. So we had lost most of our operators, but we had a lot of clerical workers. And then there was plant, and the plant guys were the most vocal and voted the most. And so I lived in New Jersey, so the Jersey people liked me. They saw me as an ally. I was a woman, so the clerical workers liked me, and also they knew that I was able to talk to them about clerical jobs I had had before working for UPS in customer service.
Right, so you knew there.
And I was plant. And I was sort of known as being tough. I had gotten into a couple of fairly serious altercations on the picket lines. So people knew me from that.
You would stand up for them.
Yeah, and I had a pretty good history in my building as being a steward and a chief steward and winning a bunch of grievances. So it was really a perfect combination. And the fact is, the leadership was terrible. I mean, the guys would go to the bar. They would go to the local office in the morning, go to the bar in the afternoon. They were not responsive. All the things that people say about bad union leadership is what they represented. And, I think they really saw me, and hopefully they saw me as an alternative to that.
Right. So that was quite an achievement.
It was quite an achievement.
Right.
And I took it so seriously that I didn't just want to be a little bit better. I wanted to really try to have a different kind of local.
So for people who don't know unions, will you explain how your work status changes when you became the president of the union?
Well, actually, it didn't change as much as it would have if I hadn't done what I did, which is in many cases, my local had about 2,500 people at that point, which is just on the borderline of being able to afford to have a full-time officers. I decided that I thought it was important for the officers not to be off the job all the time, that it was important for them to show up at work, even if it was just a few times a month, to make sure that they knew what was happening on the job and that people had access to us. So that was one of the first things that I changed, actually. Also, I started, people always complaining about unions not communicating with people. I had a daily tape that people could call into, that I would talk for about a minute or two about what if anything was going on, what the situation was in the union, what the big battles were. And in fact, it became so well known that people all over the country, we had to change our system, because people all over the country started calling it to get information, because there was not good information. So I really tried to change it. Also, I had a very diverse board. I had a male secretary treasurer.
Perfect.
I had my vice president was a black male who had been an operator for a long time and had become plant. And this wasn't, I keep telling people, it wasn't by design that I said I have to have, a black man, an Asian man, I have to have women. It was truly picking the best people at the time.
Perfect.
And people go, how did you do that? I just picked the best people at the time and asked them to run with me. And we really had a wonderful board. And it was good, because I think you have to understand your own strengths and weaknesses. And I was not good at certain things, and I was good at other things. I was good at big strategy. I was good at writing. I was good at communicating. I was good at coming up with ideas for how we could fight the company. I was good at a lot of those. I wasn't good at the nitty-gritty, a lot of the nitty-gritty of, I was a decent grievance handler, obviously, but that really wasn't what I was in love with doing.
Right.
But we had people on the board who
were
could do
good.
all those different things, and we really had a good division of labor.
Beautiful.
So that we could each do what we were best at.
Wonderful. What a nice community working together.
Yeah, and we were successful. I was elected. We'd never had a local president elected twice in a row before. I was elected 4 times. Never had opposition. So
Amazing.
I guess, and I loved it. As much as it was a strange thing, and because it was a very male-dominated local.
Right.
People said, "How can you work with these guys?" And aren't they, show? Of course, they have all the weaknesses of everybody else in America. They were chauvinists. Some of them were racist. They were anti-Semitic.
Right.
They were all kinds of things. But I really got to love them all. You learn how to, you pick your fights, and you bring them along. My secretary treasurer voted for Reagan when we first met. By the time we were finished, he's like, liberal Democrat. People change, and you have to give people room to change.
Excellent point.
and if you just stop on them as soon as you meet them because they're they're not as perfect as you would like them to be. I never would have become president of the local. I never would have done any of the things I accomplished.
How did things change for women within the company?
Well, I think, while this was going on in my local,
Yeah.
there's also the national union.
Yes.
And I tried, and I began to play a bigger and bigger role
Right.
in the national union at conventions. I ran against a man on bargaining who never should have had that position. He ran for a marketing seat. He never should have had that spot. I ran against him. So I was elected to bargaining, which is an AT&T is a national bargaining table. It's not.
Mm-hmm.
So I ran for that in 1992. We had a group of local presidents called the Ad Hoc, which was local presidents from all around the country whose job was to communicate better and to try to fight for better things within the part of AT&T, the part of the union that I was part of nationally. Mm-hmm. And then there were a group of women. Annie Crump is one of the women that you interviewed,
Right.
who sort of took me under their wing because they were on bargaining with me the first time I was on bargaining, and really taught me the ropes about how to do things at the national convention, how to sort of work the floor, how we can get allies, and they took me to school. They're tough teachers, and we just got more. We really played a role, I think, in both fighting for all kinds of things, including women's rights, and against the lack of women's staff, or the treatment of women's staff was an issue that we took up.
Right.
But we really did have a role nationally, and also. In the past, when I first became local president, most of the women presidents were from operator services locals. And I think my example and my mentorship of some of them really changed that. And more locals that were mixed locals
Right.
started having women leadership. So when I first entered the Ad Hoc, this group of local presidents from around the country, there were maybe 3 other women, and most of them were from operating services local. And I think by the time I left being a local president and I became the co-chair of the Ad Hoc, there were probably 15
Okay. That's
local presidents. So, in that group.
Mm-hmm.
So that changed a lot.
Were the women able to have an impact on any issues? Legislative or political issues?
Well, I think certainly in terms of bargaining, it's a union shop, so it wasn't like in the same title, different people would get paid for different wages.
Right.
But there were titles. In fact, one of the big issues was a creation of a second-tier title among clerical workers. So there were these traditional clerical titles that were fairly decently paid.
Okay.
And then the current vice president, who we didn't like very much at the time, negotiated sort of a second tier of titles that did fairly similar work, but wasn't much lower paid. So it became one of the sort of principles of our bargaining teams that even if we had the overall wage increase had to be cut down a little bit, we would do something to increase those wages, and that meant not just having percentage wages, because if there's always percentage increases, then the guys always continue to get further and further, and the clerical workers, get less wages. So we always would do things like we came up with, adding lump sum payments to them, or adding particular dollar amounts to the lower titles to try to get them a little bit extra. So I think because of who was on the bargaining team, we paid a lot more attention to those kind of issues. We even tried, unsuccessfully, to change the way we paid for medical in the last few years, when we had to start paying to medical, so that the lower paid titles would pay proportionally less. And we weren't successful, but we was very conscious of that as an issue that had to be fought.
What about pregnancy discrimination? By
the time I started, that issue had sort of somewhat been resolved.
Okay.
Either, through, there was a lawsuit around New York
Right.
Tele and Western
Right.
Electric, and so that issue had really been resolved. There was a lot of bitterness about it because some parts of the company, the case affected, and other parts it didn't. So there were some women who never got their seniority back, and there was some discussion and bitterness about it. But going forward, it wasn't. It wasn't a problem.
So lots accomplished over that period of time.
Yeah, I loved it. It was fun. I think, as much as it was, there was a huge number of layoffs. So
Yes,
my local
because
went from
companies-
2,400 to 350. So by the time I took the job as a CWA staff, my local was down to 350. I was spending 4.5 days a week on the job. I really felt like I was being wasted, sort of.
So you experienced really the decimation of
Yeah.
AT&T as a
And
company.
but I was always I was happier in my local than I was on staff. There are constraints. You work for an organization.
Right.
You have to edit yourself in a way that I never had to do as being local
Right,
president. As
right.
long as my members were happy with me,
Right, because you were you.
they-
Right.
when I was on staff, I did have to censor myself a lot, and I didn't like that.
Right. Right. So you served as the local president for how many years, and then you went to CWA staff? Is that
19
right?
years.
19
And
years.
then I got, and it was an interesting relationship because I had run against for vice president, I had run against a previous vice president, his successor, and I developed a relationship, through a lot of hard work, and he eventually hired me as staff. Other people in the office held grudges against me, but he didn't.
Interesting.
And he brought me on as staff, and I eventually became the assistant to the next vice president.
Okay. So you completed your career with CWA at the staff level in Washington?
I completed my career as assistant to the vice president
Assistant to
of
the vice president.
Communications Technologies, which
Alright.
is our division, which
Okay.
as a whole, when I ran for vice president in 1999, there was 60,000 votes. When I left, the office serviced only about 3,500 people.
Oh my goodness.
3,500
That
people.
is amazing.
So it
So
was,
that was both the breakup of AT&T and then just the technology revolution taking away the jobs.
breakup of
Am I
AT&T,
right?
the outsourcing of huge amounts of
Outsourcing.
work overseas. It's a combination of technology, outsourcing, just general efficiencies. Once the companies re-merged, and any redundant functions got taken away from us, basically, because we were the old long lines, landline, section of AT&T. So any work that was redundant was moved into the local companies, which was stronger, and it was sad. I mean, it was terribly sad to see what happened. But and the jobs that are left, I mean, it's fortunate, at least in AT&T, that there's a union in AT&T Wireless, but most of that is from Verizon is non-union, so a lot of the work is non-union, and we didn't have competition before.
So yeah, do you have any thoughts on whether that story could have ended differently if something different had been done, or are we just in a very, very difficult period across the country?
I said at the time when I was fighting internally in the company that I did not think the fight was waged well. That was, looking back on my more mature self, I'm not. Can I say for sure that there would have been anything different if we had fought these battles differently?
Right.
Who can say?
Yeah.
At the time, I really felt that there were compromises we made that we should not have made, that there were fights that we should have fought that we didn't fight, that there were accommodations made to the leadership of AT&T and these companies that should not have been made. But,
Right.
who knows if
Right.
the results would have been different.
Right.
I just know I was angry all the time that I didn't think we were fighting
Hard.
hard enough.
Yeah.
And I made that point abundantly clear to my to my fellow unionists.
Right. Did you work on any, in addition to the issues of CWA and the workplace issues as well as some of the women's issues, were there other issues that you worked on, social justice issues as an adult along with your CWA work?
I don't know, CWA was really full-time.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, I was part of, demonstrations against the war in Iraq.
Right,
I mean, there
right,
were, any women's marches. I mean,
Right.
I was absolutely for reproductive rights.
Right.
My daughter went to her first a giant demonstration for choice. I remember we came down to Washington when she was 12 and brought her friends with her. So we were always, that was always an issue that was
Okay.
near and dear to us. In fact, the doctor who delivered my daughter was pro-choice was doing abortions before they were legal, and
Mm-hmm.
he was somebody I really greatly admired.
Mm-hmm.
So that was always an issue that I was
Right.
active in.
Yeah.
And then just anti-war. My husband was always very involved in healthcare issues, so my husband's a full-time activist also, and trade unionist, and all my children all grew up to be activists and
Okay.
labor activists, and so
Wonderful.
this was our life. This was dinner
Yes.
table conversation, breakfast
Was
conversation.
and is. Right. Is there anything that we've forgotten to talk about or that you'd like to talk about?
I'm so glad I took the route that I did. There's
Yes.
a lot of young people now, particularly in the labor movement itself, including my son, who went to college, studied labor relations, and then joined unions as staff.
Yes.
And a lot of unions now are run by people who've never actually worked the job itself, but came on as staff.
Right.
And I just think that, it's not for everybody, but I think the route I took of
Right.
getting the job, learning to be good at the job, because it's important. If you're not good at your job, then you can't
Right.
gain the respect of your fellow workers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Working my way up through the organization just gave me so much more freedom, to say what I wanted to say and do what I wanted to do, and not have to worry about getting fired because some leader didn't like what I said.
Right.
And I just, I'm not saying that's for everyone, but I think that having that hands-on experience just made my life just so much richer, and made my contributions to the union much better. And I'm glad there's very little that I would say that I regret.
Right.